Ottawa, August 1941. Inside a Victorian mansion at 345 Laurier Avenue East, a young woman stared at rows of numbers that made no sense. Intercepted radio transmissions from the Vichy French fleet, encrypted, scrambled, unreadable. The British hadn't cracked it, the Americans hadn't cracked it, but Canada had just started trying. The woman's name doesn't appear in most history books. Like so many of the women who worked at Canada's examination unit, her contribution remained classified for decades. But what she and her colleagues accomplished in that mansion next door to the Prime Minister's residence would change the course of intelligence gathering. They would crack a code that had stumped the Allies, and they would do it using nothing more than mathematics, pattern recognition, and sheer determination. This is the untold story of how Canadian women became code breakers. How they turned numbers into intelligence, how they proved that any code made by humans could be broken by humans, and how they did it before anyone else. When World War II began in September 1939, Canada had a problem. The country had no foreign intelligence capability, none. While Britain operated its government code and cipher school, and the United States had its own cryptographic services, Canada depended entirely on its allies for decoded intelligence. Every intercepted enemy transmission had to be sent to London or Washington. Canada was blind. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Canadian military and censorship officials were intercepting enemy communications constantly. Radio signals from German agents in South America, diplomatic messages from Vichy France, Japanese naval traffic. But without the ability to decrypt these messages, the intercepts were useless, strings of meaningless numbers and letters. The government knew something had to change. In June 1941, the examination unit was born. A civilian cryptographic bureau hidden within the National Research Council to keep its budget and activities secret. The unit reported directly to the Department of External Affairs, the foreign ministry that would later become Global Affairs Canada. And it was given a mission that seemed almost impossible: catch up to British and American code-breaking capabilities. Fast. The examination unit started small, 9 people, a mix of academics, mathematicians, linguists. They set up operations in a modest office, working with whatever encrypted intercepts Canadian forces could provide. The challenges were immense. Cryptanalysis requires specialized knowledge, mathematical skills, language expertise, patience, and above all, secrecy. But within 2 months, something remarkable happened. By August 1941, this tiny Canadian team had successfully solved several codes and ciphers used by Germany, Japan, Vichy France, and Colombia. Some of these codes had not been given attention by the code-breaking services of Britain and the United States. The Canadians, starting from scratch, had found patterns that the more established services had missed. And then came the breakthrough: the transposition cipher used by the Vichy fleet. A complex encryption system that scrambled French naval communications. The British and Americans hadn't cracked it yet, but the examination unit did. They figured it out, and they immediately shared their solution with their allies. It was Canada's first major contribution to Allied intelligence, and it proved something crucial. Canada could do this work. Canadian cryptanalysts could compete with the best in the world. But here's what makes the story even more remarkable. Roughly 40% of the examination unit's workforce were women, young women, many fresh from university, recruited for their mathematical ability and language skills. Women who had been told their entire lives that mathematics and intelligence work were male domains. Women who would prove that assumption catastrophically wrong. The examination unit moved to the Victorian mansion at 345 Laurier Avenue East in March 1942. The building sat directly next to Laurier House, the residence of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. Having the codebreakers working right next door to the Prime Minister meant that critical intelligence could reach the highest levels of government within minutes. No delays, no intermediaries. The decoded messages went straight to the people making decisions about Canada's war effort. The mansion was guarded 24 hours a day by the Veterans Guard, men who had served in the First World War. Security was absolute. Anyone who worked in the building had to swear an oath of secrecy. They could not tell their families what they did. They could not discuss their work with friends. They could barely acknowledge that their job existed. Inside, the examination unit operated like a miniature Bletchley Park. Different sections worked on different codes. One team focused on French communications, both Vichy and Free French. Another tackled Japanese naval codes. A third analyzed German diplomatic traffic. The intercepted messages came in constantly, raw streams of encrypted text that had to be decrypted, translated, and analyzed. The work was painstaking. Cryptanalysis is not like the movies. There's no magic moment where the code suddenly reveals itself. It's hours, days, sometimes weeks of staring at sequences of numbers and letters, looking for patterns, repeated sequences, common words, statistical anomalies, anything that might provide a foothold into the encryption system. And the mathematics involved were complex. Different cipher systems required different approaches. A substitution cipher, where each letter is replaced by another letter or number, required frequency analysis. In any language, certain letters appear more often than others. In English, the letter E is the most common. In French, E and A dominate. By analyzing the frequency of symbols in the encrypted text, codebreakers could make educated guesses about which encrypted symbols represented which letters. But transposition ciphers were different. In a transposition cipher, the letters aren't replaced. They're rearranged, scrambled according to a mathematical pattern. The message, "Attack at dawn," might become "Atkat natak," or any other permutation depending on the transposition key. The original letters are all still there, just in the wrong order. Breaking a transposition cipher meant figuring out the mathematical pattern used to scramble the text. This is what the Vichy Fleet cipher used, a columnar transposition system. The French operators would write their message in rows, then transmit it by reading down the columns. But the columns weren't transmitted in order. They were scrambled according to a key. Unless you knew the key, the message was unreadable. The examination unit's team studying French codes worked methodically. They collected intercepts. They analyzed message lengths. They looked for repeated phrases, standard military terminology that would appear frequently in naval communications, weather reports, position coordinates, ship names. These known elements, called cribs in cryptanalysis, provided anchor points. And then came the mathematical insight. Someone on the team, likely one of the women with strong mathematical backgrounds, recognized the pattern, the way certain letter combinations appeared in the scrambled text, the statistical signatures that suggested a columnar transposition. Once they identified the cipher type, they could work backwards to determine the key length, how many columns were being used, what order they were transmitted in. It was brilliant work, tedious, meticulous, mathematically sophisticated work. And when they finally broke the cipher, they immediately shared the solution with the British and Americans. The intelligence from Vichy Fleet Communications proved valuable. After France fell to Germany in June 1940, the Vichy government controlled significant naval assets in the Mediterranean and French colonies. The British desperately needed to know where these ships were, what they were doing, whether they might be turned over to the Germans. The Canadian breakthrough gave the Allies eyes on the Vichy fleet. It demonstrated Canadian cryptographic capability, and it established the examination unit as a valued intelligence partner. No longer would Canada be entirely dependent on London and Washington. Canada could contribute. Canada could crack codes that others hadn't solved. The unit expanded rapidly. By 1943, approximately 40 people worked in the mansion. The majority of the expansion came from recruiting women, young women with degrees in mathematics, languages, or sciences, women who could keep secrets, women who could handle the intense mental strain of cryptanalysis. Among them was Sylvia Gelman, who would later recall that she felt the whole operation was amazing. Gelman had lost a brother in the war. She understood the stakes. Every message they decoded could save lives. Every cipher they broke gave Allied commanders better information. The work mattered in the most fundamental way. Another was Sonia Morowitz, a Jewish refugee from Czechoslovakia who had fled the Nazi invasion. She arrived in Canada and was recruited to the examination unit in June 1943. Her job focused on French communications, looking for numerical sequences that corresponded to common French words. She later described the work as enjoyable, like solving crossword puzzles. But these puzzles had life and death consequences. The women worked long hours in the mansion. When they weren't busy decrypting, they would look out the windows and watch Prime Minister Mackenzie King walking his dog. There was no security for the Prime Minister at that time. Just an elderly man with his pet, walking past the building where some of Canada's most sensitive intelligence work was happening. The contrast was surreal. The examination unit increasingly specialized in Japanese and French traffic. As the war progressed and Canada's relationship with Vichy France ended, the unit pivoted to Free French communications. The Free French, led by Charles de Gaulle, used codes and ciphers that were variations of systems the Canadians had already broken. This made the transition relatively smooth, but it also meant the Canadians could provide intelligence on Free French activities and intentions, information that proved valuable for diplomatic and military planning. By late 1942 and into 1943, the examination unit was fully integrated into Allied intelligence networks. They received raw intercepts from Canadian forces. They shared their decrypts with British and American agencies. They collaborated with Bletchley Park in England, the legendary code-breaking center where Alan Turing and thousands of others worked to break German Enigma ciphers. The Canadian contribution was smaller in scale than Bletchley Park or American operations. But it was significant. The examination unit provided independent Canadian intelligence, reducing reliance on allies. It gave Canadian government officials and ministers direct access to decoded enemy communications. Prime Minister Mackenzie King and the Department of External Affairs could read intercepted diplomatic messages without waiting for British or American summaries. This enhanced Canada's autonomy and influence within the Allied coalition. The work also forged lasting intelligence partnerships. The relationships built during the war between Canadian, British, and American cryptanalysts would eventually evolve into the Five Eyes Alliance, the intelligence-sharing partnership that continues to this day. Canada proved it could be a trusted partner. Canadian codebreakers demonstrated competence, discretion, and capability, but the human cost of this work is often forgotten. The stress was immense. These were young women, many in their early 20s, handling classified material that could determine the outcome of battles. They couldn't share the burden with anyone. They couldn't tell their families about breakthroughs or frustrations. They carried the secrets alone, and the work was relentless. Messages arrived constantly, deadlines were tight. Every hour of delay meant intelligence growing stale. A decoded message about ship movements had to reach decision-makers while the ships were still where the message said they would be. Old intelligence was useless intelligence. The women of the examination unit rose to the challenge. They worked the long hours. They maintained the secrecy. They broke the codes, and they did it while facing assumptions that women couldn't handle such intellectually demanding work, that mathematics was too hard for female minds. That intelligence analysis required masculine logic. Every message they decoded proved those assumptions wrong. Every cipher they broke demonstrated that intelligence and capability have nothing to do with gender. The women at the examination unit were doing work as sophisticated and important as any being done anywhere in the world. By mid-1943, the unit was operating at full capacity. The Victorian mansion hummed with activity. Typewriters clattered as decoded messages were transcribed. Analysts pored over intercepts looking for patterns. Linguists translated the decrypted French and Japanese into English. The intelligence flowed from the mansion to government officials, contributing to Canada's war effort in ways that would remain secret for decades. But the war was far from over, and the codes kept getting more complex. As 1943 turned into 1944, the examination unit would face new challenges, new ciphers, new priorities. And the women who had proven themselves would continue to demonstrate that no code was unbreakable. Not when you had mathematics, determination, and brilliant minds willing to spend hours staring at numbers until they revealed their secrets. As 1944 turned into 1945, the war entered its final phase. In Europe, Allied armies were pushing into Germany itself. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, was collapsing. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan. The strategic bombing campaign was devastating Japanese cities. Victory was coming, but it would come at a terrible cost. Inside the Victorian mansion on Laurier Avenue East, the examination unit continued its work. The focus had shifted almost entirely to Japanese communications. With Germany's surrender in May 1945, the French section shut down. The unit vacated the mansion and consolidated operations with the Canadian Army's Joint Discrimination Unit at the former La Salle Academy on Sussex Drive. The war against Japan continued, and the code breakers were needed more than ever. The intelligence flowing from Japanese decrypts painted a grim picture. Japan was preparing for a final, apocalyptic defense of the home islands. Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion, was scheduled for November 1945. Military planners estimated it would require over 1.7 million American troops. The projected casualties were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested hundreds of thousands of Allied deaths. Some projections went much higher. The Japanese military had mobilized millions of soldiers and civilians. They were digging fortifications, stockpiling weapons, training civilians to fight with bamboo spears if necessary. The cultural code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded resistance to the death. The intercepted Japanese communications revealed the scale of the preparations: kamikaze aircraft by the thousands, suicide submarines, beach defenses that would make the Normandy landings look easy by comparison. Every piece of intelligence mattered. Every decoded message gave Allied commanders insight into Japanese strength, deployments, intentions. The women at the examination unit weren't just breaking codes anymore, they were helping save lives. Every decrypt that revealed Japanese positions meant Allied planners could adjust their strategies. Every message that exposed Japanese weaknesses meant fewer Allied soldiers would die, but the invasion never came. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, another bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. After 6 years of global conflict, after tens of millions of deaths, after entire cities reduced to rubble, it was finally over. The examination unit shut down its Japanese section. The Joint Discrimination Unit closed in June 1946. The war was won. The codes no longer needed breaking. The women who had spent years staring at encrypted messages, looking for patterns, solving mathematical puzzles that determined the fate of nations, could finally go home. But what would they go home to? The post-war world was not kind to women who had proven themselves during the war. The gains made between 1939 and 1945 proved temporary. Industries that had welcomed women workers during wartime now wanted them gone. The men were coming home, they needed jobs, and society had very clear ideas about where women belonged. Not in laboratories, not in intelligence agencies, not in positions of authority or intellectual leadership. At home, raising children, supporting husbands, returning to traditional roles as if the war had never happened. 17 experienced examination unit staff members were selected to continue intelligence work in the newly created Communications Research Center, which became the communications branch of the National Research Council in September 1946. This was the foundation for what would eventually become the Communications Security Establishment, Canada's Signals Intelligence Agency. But those 17 positions represented a fraction of the approximately 40 people who had worked at the examination unit during the war. The others were let go, thanked for their service, sent home, and they were sworn to secrecy. The Official Secrets Act bound them for decades. They could not tell their families what they had done during the war. They could not share their accomplishments. They could not claim credit for breaking codes that had stumped the Americans and British. They had to live with the knowledge of their contribution locked inside them, unable to share it with anyone. Sylvia Gelman returned to civilian life. Sonia Morawetz, the Jewish refugee from Czechoslovakia who had found purpose and meaning in the cryptographic work, also left the service. The women who had proven that mathematical brilliance and analytical capability had nothing to do with gender went back to a world that still believed women belonged in the kitchen, not the laboratory. The injustice of this is profound. These women had contributed to one of the most important intelligence operations of World War II. Canada's examination unit had achieved genuine breakthroughs. The transposition cipher used by the Vichy fleet cracked in August 1941 before the British or Americans solved it. Intelligence on French diplomatic and military communications that gave Canadian officials independent sources of information. Collaboration with allied code-breaking services that established Canada as a trusted intelligence partner. The foundations for post-war signals intelligence cooperation that would become the Five Eyes Alliance. All of this accomplished by a team of fewer than 50 people, roughly 40% of them women, working with limited resources. No computers, no advanced technology, just mathematics, languages, pattern recognition, and relentless determination. They had proven that Canada could compete with the cryptographic giants of Britain and America, that Canadian intelligence could make unique contributions, that women could excel at work requiring the highest levels of analytical and mathematical skill. And for decades, nobody knew. The examination unit's work remained classified. The women who had broken codes could not tell their stories. Historians writing about World War II focused on battles and generals, on military strategy and diplomatic negotiations. The code breakers, when mentioned at all, were usually the famous ones. Alan Turing at Bletchley Park, the American cryptanalysts who broke Japanese naval codes, the dramatic stories that fit established narratives of male genius and heroism. The Canadian contribution was footnoted. The women's contribution was invisible. It wasn't a conspiracy to hide their achievements. It was simply the way history was written. Women's work, unless it fit traditional narratives of nursing or support roles, was overlooked. Intelligence work, which by nature remained classified for years, was doubly hidden. The combination meant that the story of the examination unit and the women who made it successful disappeared. It would take decades for the truth to emerge. As documents were declassified, as historians began asking different questions, as the narrative of World War II expanded beyond military operations to include intelligence, technology, home front contributions, the full picture started to appear. Researchers discovered the examination unit's files. They found the personnel records. They located the women who had worked there, now elderly, and interviewed them about their experiences. What emerged was remarkable. These women had lived their entire lives carrying secrets. They had made extraordinary contributions to the war effort and could never claim credit. They had proven themselves capable of work that society claimed women couldn't do, then returned to a world that still believed those claims, and they had done it all with grace, dignity, and without bitterness. When Sonia Morawetz was finally able to talk about her wartime work, she described it as enjoyable, like solving crossword puzzles. She didn't talk about the pressure, the long hours, the weight of knowing that lives depended on her accuracy. She didn't express anger at being forgotten. She simply shared her memories, happy that finally someone wanted to know. Sylvia Gelman spoke about how amazing the whole operation had been, how important the work felt, how motivated they were by the knowledge that they were contributing to the war effort. She had lost a brother in the war. The cryptographic work was personal for her. Every message decoded might save other families from similar loss. The recognition, when it finally came, was modest. Historical plaques, academic papers, museum exhibits about Canadian intelligence during World War II. The women who were still alive received acknowledgement of their contribution, but most had already passed away. They lived their lives and died without public recognition of what they had accomplished. This raises uncomfortable questions. How many other stories remain hidden? How many women made critical contributions to the war effort, to scientific advancement, to intelligence operations, and were simply forgotten? How much talent was wasted because society refused to acknowledge women's capabilities? How much progress was delayed because half the population was excluded from fields where they could have excelled? The examination unit's story provides a partial answer. When necessity forced societies to utilize women's talents, women performed brilliantly. The Canadian women who broke codes did so with skill equal to their male colleagues. The British women at Bletchley Park made essential contributions to breaking Enigma. American women worked in cryptanalysis, aviation, engineering, science. Polish women in the resistance performed acts of extraordinary courage. Soviet women flew combat missions, commanded tanks, served as snipers. But when the emergency ended, society reverted. The doors that had opened during wartime closed, opportunities vanished. Women who had proven themselves capable of complex analytical work were told to go home. Traditional gender roles reasserted themselves. It would take decades, generations, for those doors to open again. And even today, the struggle continues for full recognition of women's capabilities and contributions. The mathematical trick that broke the Vichy transposition cipher wasn't crazy at all. It was sophisticated frequency analysis combined with pattern recognition. It was understanding that even scrambled text contains statistical signatures. It was recognizing that columnar transposition creates specific letter distribution patterns that can be detected and exploited. It was mathematics, pure, elegant, powerful mathematics. And the women who figured it out were brilliant. They deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes, not as supporting characters in someone else's story, but as the skilled cryptanalysts they were, as pioneers who helped establish Canadian signals intelligence, as women who proved that intellectual capability is human, not gendered, as individuals who made real, measurable contributions to Allied victory in World War II. The Communications Security Establishment, Canada's modern signals intelligence agency, traces its lineage directly back to the examination unit. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which remains one of the most important intelligence-sharing partnerships in the world, has roots in the wartime cooperation that the examination unit helped establish. Canadian cryptographic capabilities, which today operate at the cutting edge of cybersecurity and signals intelligence, were founded by that small team working in a Victorian mansion during the war. And roughly 40% of that founding team were women. Women who could not vote in all provinces when they were born. Women who grew up in a world that told them mathematics and science were male domains. Women who were expected to be wives and mothers, not cryptanalysts and intelligence officers. Women who proved all of those expectations wrong. The next time you hear about World War II codebreakers, remember them. Remember the women of the examination unit. Remember Sylvia Gelman and Sonia Morowitz and the dozens of others whose names appear in personnel files but not in history books. Remember that when Canada broke the Vichy transposition cipher in August 1941, before the Americans and British solved it, women were part of that team. Essential parts, not assistants, not secretaries, cryptanalysts. Remember that the mathematical trick that cracked the code wasn't a trick at all. It was expertise. It was skill. It was hours of painstaking analysis by people who understood that every message decoded might save lives. It was women doing work that society claimed they couldn't do, and doing it brilliantly. And remember that history has a tendency to forget women's contributions unless we actively work to remember them. The women of the examination unit were silent for decades, not because their work wasn't important, but because nobody asked about it. Because the narratives of World War II didn't include space for women cryptanalysts. Because classified work remains hidden longer when the people who did it aren't considered historically significant. That's changing now. Slowly. Too slowly. But it's changing. We're learning to ask different questions, to look beyond the traditional narratives, to recognize that history is made by all kinds of people, not just the ones who fit conventional ideas of heroes. The Victorian mansion at 345 Laurier Avenue East is gone now. The building that housed Canada's wartime code-breaking operation no longer stands, but its legacy remains. In the Communications Security Establishment, in the Five Eyes Alliance, in the recognition, finally, that Canadian women helped win World War II, not just by supporting the war effort, but by making direct, essential contributions to intelligence operations. One Canadian woman's math trick cracked a code before the Americans did. But it wasn't one woman. It was dozens. It wasn't a trick. It was mathematics, and the reason we're only learning about it now, decades later, is because we forgot to ask. We forgot to look. We forgot that women were there, doing essential work, making history. We won't forget again. This is their story. The story of the women who broke codes, who proved their capability, who helped win a war, and who spent decades in silence waiting for someone to finally ask what they did. They were cryptanalysts. They were pioneers. They were brilliant. And they deserved to be remembered, not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as what they were, essential contributors to one of the most important intelligence operations of World War II, women who used mathematics to crack codes that helped win the war. Canadians who established their country's signals intelligence capability, heroes whose story we're finally beginning to tell.